one thing that is obvious about what we've been discussing so far is that all the examples we've taken from so far are from the western end of Eurasia, from Europe, Islam and so on, and from the eastern end, Japan and China, and to a certain extent India. It's all that continent. And we've rather taken it for granted that this is where the origins of our world developed from. But it wouldn't have been at all self-evident if we do our last pulling back and go back, instead of 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Because we can now look at the whole globe and the whole process from the domestication, the full domestication of animals and plants, and look at the whole world and pose the question, which is a fascinating one: why did much of this occur on that continent and not on Australia, the Americas early on, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on? So I wondered whether we could maybe finally conclude by pulling right out and right back and proceed to look at this question. The very simple theory that some people have put forward, I remember hearing this as a school child, is that the reason why we were successful and they weren't was that basically it was a matter of luck. It wasn't anything to do with the virtue or the intelligence of Europeans or Chinese. It was that in these two areas, independently probably, and in particular in the area in Mesopotamia, the area of the Fertile Crescent, there were by chance a number of species of animals, like sheep and goats and so on, which you could domesticate. And there were lots of lovely little grains or bits of grass which were easy and effective to domesticate. So by chance in this area and through climate changes which exacerbated this, they developed a productive agricultural system, and the same thing happened independently in China. Whereas the less, as you might say, fortunate continents, sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, Australia, didn't have just this right mix. They had one or two, but they certainly didn't have nearly as many and as useful in any of these agricultural processes. And this is why it happened there and not on the other continents. Now, it all seems a bit simple to me, but I wonder what other people think of that theory.
What's the it? It happened.
It happened, that is, that agriculture developed. Well, perhaps I ought to spell that. Civilization, as we know it, developed. That is to say, the domestication of animals, the domestication of plants, then the ramification of all the technologies which flow out of this. The population expands. You have the development of cities, you have the development of writing, you have the development of pottery, weaving, metalwork, all these things which we now think of as the birth of our civilization, the Neolithic Revolution, as it's sometimes called. That happened there and in China, nowhere else. The rest just remained hunters and gatherers.
Well, are the facts correct? That is to say, when Columbus and the first Europeans arrive in America, is this really a society that missed out on civilization? Do they find hunters and gatherers? That's not what I recall. I recall a some very sophisticated political systems, literate indeed, with a writing system, with very good systems of calendars and time measurement, sophisticated agriculture. Many of the crops that they were growing were things that Europeans were all too glad to take with them to Europe. We think only of maize, of potatoes, of tobacco.
You mean areas like Mexico? And
of course, and the Inca Empire. In some sense, one could argue, go back to your, the bad luck of the American Indians, or the pre-Columbian Americans, as we should call them, is that Europeans got there a few centuries before they would have perhaps done what the Europeans did. There is absolutely no reason to believe that the things that European society achieves in the 18th and 19th century wouldn't have been achieved by these civilizations, perhaps at a somewhat later time. But their bad luck was that the Europeans showed up there one day, uninvited, one might add, and spread death and damnation wherever they came, and essentially wiped out these cultures.
When I hear people talk about our civilization in the way perhaps Alan inadvertently did a little while ago, I'm reminded of the remark made by Mahatma Gandhi when he first got off, as an Indian statesman, got off a plane in Britain, and a journalist came up to him and said, "Well, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of the civilization of Europe?" And he replied, "I think it would be a very good idea."
Yes, and if we go outward from those urban societies that were developed in Mexico, Peru, etc., which had certainly achieved all these major advances we associate with civilization, culture, etc., and look to some of the native North American societies, such as where I come from, the Haida societies. Again, we see in Canada very advanced political systems and systems. The systems, a system based on the fisheries, had produced a very different kind of social system than in other Native American communities. One of a very settled kind of system, and also that there's this. We can look also at the spiritual, the religious dimensions of these societies, which were in many ways far more interesting and advanced than what had developed in Europe. And this is depicted in systems of art and representation, which are of enormous interest to us now, and trying to decode these and interpret this is something that we still, many of us still don't understand at all.
In the same way that I wouldn't like to proclaim the superiority of some particular kind of European civilization over others, I'm on my guard against going on too much of a guilt trip about cultures that came off worst in the encounter with Europe. I don't feel I'm very interested in what is to be learned from native North American religious traditions, but very often people, when describing these, do feel bound to say that they were particularly rich and particularly interesting. Actually, the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition is a pretty rich one too, and I don't.
I wouldn't want to rank them.
Yes, I would. That's exactly. I wouldn't like to get into this game of saying
the
one
real
is richer
issue
or
is
better
the
than
real
another.
issue, of course, is still what explains the victory of Europe in the simple sense that today in Peru they speak Spanish, but in Spain nobody speaks the language that the Incas spoke.
Germs are one explanation.
Germs are the biggest explanation, but why? But that you have to take it to a little bit of a higher level, because why is it that the exchange of germs was so asymmetrical, that the only really destructive diseases that the pre-Columbian population inflicted on Europe was syphilis?
If they really did.
The evidence now is
the evidence seems to go from one decade to another.
We're in a decade in which the evidence.
We got it right at last. They gave us syphilis.
But we gave them a great deal more, and we wiped out, as is well known, the vast bulk of those populations. And the answer to that has to do, of course, with the different agricultural systems that the European practice. Because what spreads infectious disease more than anything else is the domestic animals that are around you and that live in symbiosis with the microorganisms that infect people. And the Europeans were surrounded at that time by horses, by cows, by sheep, by goats, by chickens, and so on and so forth. And what happened was that the Europeans probably were constantly sick of these diseases, but their immune systems were so the question is, above all, is not can we rank these civilizations, but why does one civilization essentially survive and ends up in a position to dominate the rest of the globe, whereas the other civilizations, by and large, disappear as living bodies and have to be resurrected by archaeologists? And a big part of the answer is germs. That say the Europeans brought a great number of diseases with them that killed off the indigenous population simply because they weren't immune to those diseases. But
smallpox, influenza?
Smallpox, influenza above all.
Measles?
Yes, measles. Those three account probably for most of it.
all these being diseases that existed in an endemic way in Europe, in the sense that children got smallpox and came through it or didn't, people might or might not get influenza, but because there's a certain amount of immunity conferred here by many of these diseases, you never get more than a small proportion of the population getting them.
Right.
Whereas
measles, still in my lifetime, was known as a childhood disease,
Exactly.
which was
Oh, yes.
important that you caught as a child because then you recovered quickly
that's right.
and then you were immune to it. But if you impose upon an adult population people who carry measles, they will die off real quick.
people of productive age will
Yes.
die.
And so the standard story is that it's germs that did it. But I would like to add that I'm not entirely satisfied that that is the whole story, because there's a certain characteristic, at least of the Europeans who end up in America, the Corteses and the Pizarros of this world, a certain ruthlessness, a certain aggression that I think is something that these native people have perhaps not entirely encountered. The way in which the Europeans cheat and lie and trick these populations in a goal-oriented way, sort of to disrupt their political structure, I think is, and the way they could organize themselves in the sense of having incredibly long supply lines, and still being able to continuously keep in touch with Europe and bring in reinforcement when they needed it. I think it shows that there are differences in the level of political organization as well. And
So the key there is a mixture of hypocrisy and violence.
I think so, but violence that is, it's not just that they're violent, it's that it's organized violence, and the organization is better. There is better discipline.
After all, Aztec society is not a non-violent one.
It's
Put it
not at
mildly,
all.
the last Inca
Oh.
arred for his brother to be executed while he was a
No,
captive
there's
of
no
the
question
Spanish.
that Europeans never had any
These are not saintly,
not
gentle
at
people
all,
they're
not
meeting
at
here.
all. But there are people who are cruel and violent in a disorganized way, and there are people who are cruel and violent in an organized way, and the ones that are organized win usually.
Yes, I think it's the organisation that
It's
is the thing.
organization,
rather
okay?
than
This is like as if you had a war of Germany against
yes.
Italy. It's not that they're different violence. The Germans are better organized.
What about their weapons? I mean, it's sometimes said that also they had steel weapons.
They had steel
the
weapons.
horse makes
And
a
the
difference.
horse.
The
And
horse
the
does
horses.
make a
I've never been persuaded how much different the horses made, at least at the beginning, because there can't have been too many of them
There
given
weren't
that they had
that
to be
many,
shipped over from Europe, although their psychological impact may have been quite good. But certainly the fact that they had arms made out of steel, daggers and swords, did make a difference. But remember, they were the numerical odds were absurd. I mean, you have a handful of people against entire armies. And so I'm not sure that steel, that in man-to-man combat, a steel dagger may make a difference if the numbers are really relatively even. But if you're talking about gaps of 1 to 10 or 1 to
you wonder why the Incas didn't all just throw stones at the Spanish.
well,
until
because
they knocked them
maybe
all
they
out.
did, but they weren't organized enough to
Yes.
not hit each other. I mean,
These are they were very brave, because the Spanish were actually cutting down the nobles who were carrying the Inca's litter. And although the noble who had been previously carrying the litter had just been cut down in a welter of blood, another one would step forward to take his place at the litter so the Inca wouldn't be dropped. But they weren't being so brave and organised in fighting the Spanish.
No, and I think that does make a difference. And so I would say it's about 50% germs and 50% people, and that you cannot rule out that the culture and the political organization of Europeans by 1500 has diverged enough from others to sort of set them apart. And after all, I mean, you think about Europeans arriving in, say, India, and you see very much the same pattern. Again, there's these miraculous victories of Europeans over large Indian armies.
Well, not very quickly. Not very quickly. At first, the Europeans are very, very wary of this, because they just don't have things like mobile field artillery that enables them to confront the Indian princes on land.
No.
And they don't have any idea at first, the merchants in their factories, of actually conquering anything. What they're trying to do is use political influence to get the appropriate firman, to have trading permissions and so on.
But soon enough, they want more than that, and they start imposing conditions. And say certainly by the 1620s and 1630s, when the Dutch start arriving in the East Indies and building strongholds there, they clearly take a commanding lead over the...
Well, they're very,
Yes,
and
they
they're
were.
prepared to treat fellow Europeans very roughly too.
That's right,
They
and-
crucified British merchant Stan
No
Boyner.
doubt about it.
Yes, they were rather decided that they were
No
going
doubt
to be the
about it.
only ones.
But in a
there.
sense that underlines my point. There is an aggression and a goal-orientedness.
Well, they wouldn't have
in
got
Europe.
there. It's such a long way to go. The only people who
That's
get
it.
that far. And they're not going to be gentle strollers who just happen to turn up.
Is there a distinction to be made, since we're now talking mainly about encounters as the clue to success and comparative advantage? Is there a distinction to be made then between encounters where the European trading networks remain along the coasts with bases which were called factories? I mean, that's the original meaning of
Where
the
the
word,
factor, the
where
agent is.
Where the agent is. That's the situation in areas, for example, absolutely lethal to Europeans, like West Africa, and situations where the balance of power is by no means obviously in the European favour, as in India, the subcontinent, and most of the Indian Ocean, and certainly in Eastern Asia. That's one pattern then.
But it's not the case in the Malaccas, where the Dutch not only had they have their factories, but they actually took control over these islands. They took absolute control.
Yes, but the distinction, the gross distinction, which I'm trying to make, is one between an essentially maritime system of encounter, arrival, trade, no doubt islands are seized, occupied, and so on, and the striking contrast between any of that and what happens in the New World, which is that you get emplacement by Europeans, to be sure, in the Caribbean sector, but you also get very, very rapidly, within 3 to 4 decades of European arrival, the complete occupation of very large inland territories in the Andes, in what is now Colombia, and above all in the highlands of Mexico, which are areas, after all, under fantastically sophisticated and complex political control by indigenous people, with very well organized state systems. And so I think if one makes that kind of, I concede, very crude contrast for the encounters of the 15th until the 17th centuries, germs turn out to be a fantastically important differentiator, right? Because you simply do not see that in the Eastern Hemisphere, and that's what you see in
no doubt about it. Depopulation by this sort of unintentional germ warfare plays a great role, and yet at the same time we have to remember that the European reach out to other parts of the world wherever they can go.
Indeed.
Perhaps we ought to just move on from this a bit. In relation to animals, one bit that you quickly mentioned but should be emphasized is the reason why these germs were so widespread in Europe is the relationship with animals, that many of them were bred, the microorganisms in cows and dogs and pigs and so on, which Eurasians had, were the ones which they got used to and spread around them. So we come back again to the role of animals. And I wondered whether one of the things that really puzzles me, if we begin to move forward, you first of all have a difference in that certain parts of the world have a large stock of domesticatable animals. And then if we move forward to about 1,000 years ago, you begin to see a differentiation, which I've seen most clearly in Japan. They have a wide use and knowledge of animals, which they use for a number of purposes. But gradually over time, for various reasons, including the fact that they need every spare inch of rice or land for rice because of a large population, partly because the cost of keeping animals is higher than the cost of hiring people, the cost of labor is low. The animals dwindle and fade away, so that by the 19th century, when the Europeans came, there were hardly any animals at all in the Japanese landscape. A few small horses. That was about it. No, hardly any chickens, no pigs, no sheep, goats, etc., etc. Now, that tendency, which I've also seen happening in the village I work in the Himalayas, where there were lots of animals 30 years ago when I first went there. And now there are many less animals because they're too expensive to keep. You use human labor, your protein diet goes down, and so on. What happened in most societies, the population rises and the number of animals begins to decrease. What is really extraordinary about England, and many people have pointed this out, that by the 18th century it was a country absolutely full of animals. It had 2 or 3 times more horses than any other country.
Better animals.
Bigger, stronger, tougher.
There's that statistic about, from I think 1700 to 1800, the average weight of a cow sold at Smithfield has doubled. Isn't that right?
Something like that. I mean, it was extraordinary. Now, how could they keep all these animals? It's a smallish island. And why had the normal tendency, which happened in France as well, and in Italy and elsewhere, to move towards a kind of vegetarian diet, less and less animals? Why had this tendency been bucked, which I think is one of the real keys to the growing power available in agriculture and industry in England? I have an answer, but I wonder whether anyone
You
else...
should tell us.
Okay, well, the answer, which it comes from a scholar friend of mine, at least his suggestion, is coal. We tend to think of coal as basically the thing that fueled the Industrial Revolution. But his work on the coal industry shows, as others earlier had shown, that coal is very important in the English landscape from medieval times onwards. Even the Romans had used coal, but certainly by the time of the Black Death, coal was quite widespread. It dropped back a bit then. But by the 15th, 16th century, the glass works, the salt works, the iron works, and so on, plus the heating and warmth of London and other places. This is why you get your Whitby colliers. So basically, and the effect of this is that every other country in Europe had to use large areas for these purposes, particularly for woodland and forest, which they used.
They had to keep and renew, otherwise
they had to keep
no
and
fuel.
renew. So they either grew crops or they had woodland. In England, you had large areas of pastoral landscape for animals, which you had fed into this kind of ecology that Joel talked about, where you get the two mixing together in a new kind of combination, and the extreme form is England. So without the coal, you couldn't have got into that kind of cycle.
No, I think that's right, but there is a second component to that, which is the way you feed animals, and there's essentially 2 ways of feeding them. You can let them graze out on the fields, in which case they use up a lot of land, or you can stable feed them by feeding them crops that you have grown purposefully for feeding the animals, like turnips and crops like that. And
You
if you
can't
do
put
that,
them out to graze. A cow won't graze
no,
on
but you
turnips.
don't
Yes,
want to actually.
yes,
It turns out that if you keep them, in the stables and you feed them these sort of field-grown crops, that actually they become much fatter and give a great deal more milk than if you let them out to graze. Maybe the flavor changes in some
The
subtle
discovery
way,
of
but
turnip Townsend.
the discoveries of turnip Townsend, which actually did come from the Netherlands, where they discovered this about a century or so earlier. But whatever the case may be, it is possible to actually keep animals on a fairly small amount of land if you just change your agricultural system and you don't get it in your head. The only way to feed animals is to leave them out there in the field and let them graze, because then they will use up, of course, a lot of land. In a way, American chicken rearing has taken this to the extreme, right, where each chicken gets, in an area about this big and they barely fit in, and machines feed them, and these chickens never see daylight or breathe air-conditioned air or anything like that. It is essentially an industrial way of producing agricultural product, if I may put it that way. And in some sense, the British started that with this convertible husbandry.
Yes, but over this sort of long period of the 17th and even quite a lot of the 18th century, a lot of people could survive as small-scale very small-scale farms, or as form of peasant agriculture. You could feed a whole family.
You had access to common land.
Yes,
of course,
with access to common land, you could feed a family with 1 cow, and your access to other aspects, other parts of the common. But the economy of the cow, of 1 cow, could get you a very long way, and it allowed a lot of families to survive in rural areas in England on a little bit, some agriculture, keeping a cow or maybe a pig, doing a little bit of industry in the countryside, taking part in some textile production, etc., and all the members of the family patching together a living in this kind of way.
What are they mainly eating? I think are they at the stage then where the British bread and cheese diet, low fuel consumption, is basically what we can expect these people to be enjoying?
Yes, and vegetable growing, having the cottage garden as well.
And a pig.
Yes.
I think perhaps the other area which we perhaps ought to move on to, the two great revolutions really that occur, now we hear also in Mayan civilization, but certainly occurred in China and the Middle East. One was the agricultural revolution, the other was the organizational revolution, and in particular in relation to information technologies. The origins and development of our skills as human beings to use our minds and then to transmit that knowledge into various forms of writing and communication, and then later printing.
To make new.
What we have here is a cuneiform text made with by pressing reed pen, making wedge-shaped marks on clay. It comes from 1300 BC, and it is an early example of a commercial document because it is a contract for the sale of a young slave woman for 43 pieces of silver. This thing's baked. It stands as a record. We're not any longer dependent on someone's memory of whether the thing happened or not. We have a written record, which has come down to us today. If we wanted to dispute the legality of this sale of this poor young woman, we certainly could. And it marks an immense transition in human society when you can create records independent of what there is in people's heads, the songs they can remember, the lists of ancestors they can recite. So writing is something we have to think about as being absolutely crucial in certain deep societal changes that come not too long after the development of urban civilizations based on settled agriculture. And it's going to be an interesting point for us to look at the effects that the development of writing systems have in different parts of the world and of the different writing systems that there are. Now, it so happens that the ancient civilizations in the ancient Mediterranean, civilizations of Greece and Rome, do have the benefit of drawing on an alphabetic system for recording human speech, for generating text. So more or less you only need to learn 20 to 30 signs, and you should be able to just pick up a text and more or less read it off. You may not pronounce it perfectly accurately, as we know how peculiar English spelling is for that matter. Greek spelling is perhaps a little more phonetic. But it does mean that literacy should theoretically be a rather quick matter. On the other hand, in China, there is never an alphabetic element. There is never an element where a small number of signs are used to represent all the sounds in the language, and words are just recorded essentially by making marks which represent the sounds of the language. What happens there is that you have several different principles to generate characters, but in each case you have more or less a sign which you have to learn, which is different from all the other signs, one sign roughly for one word. And that means learning to read and write a language like that is going to take you a lot longer and to be a lot more difficult. We might like to tell ourselves a story, therefore, that says, oh, people must have been much less likely to be literate in pre-modern China because of the immense difficulty of this writing system.
How many signs were there, roughly?
If you want to be able to read a newspaper today in Chinese with relative fluency, then if you know about 5,000 different characters, that will do. But there's a smaller number than that you can get away with for many ordinary purposes. And if you pick up the biggest dictionaries and count in all the characters that are strange variants and only used once, and you can get to tens of thousands of characters, but nobody ever knew that. That's why the dictionaries are there, in case you meet them. If you look at Japan, which not only uses Chinese characters, though, but also two syllabaries called kana, which do represent spoken syllables, and has perhaps the world's most complex writing system, and one most unsuitable for its language,
Rather embarrassingly, though, for any theories that difficulty of writing system limits literacy, you find they've got the world's highest literacy rate. So I think
Only
human
by
beings...
dint of endless learning, isn't it? I mean, China and Japan are famous for their very long, intense educational systems.
Well, I'm not sure it's as necessary as that. I think that human beings have got the flexibility in their youth to learn to use almost any writing system that human beings have evolved. I don't really think it's anything like as critical as we like to make out. Our emphasis on the wonder of the alphabetic system is perhaps another piece of our Eurocentrism. Dr. Johnson in the 18th century was, in his perverse way, arguing against the popular notion that China must be a superior culture by saying, well, sir, as he always said, they have not invented an alphabet, have they? They have not done what others could do. Shows that they must be inferior in that respect. But it doesn't look as though it has quite the practical consequences people would claim.
And the fact that a Japanese schoolchild nowadays has to spend half his or her lessons learning the language and writing the language seems indicative of the fact that it is very hard.
But it doesn't seem to have crowded out their ability to learn mathematics or
No.
science. They've done pretty well in
Plenty
those
of
too.
space.
Quite able to cope. I think
Yes.
it may well simply be that there's a very high cultural value attached to the actual writing system as a thing in East Asia, certainly in the countries which have used Chinese characters, as Korea did before it decided to invent its own very good and very suitable syllabic system, as King Sejong decided it would happen there. And I think it may well not necessarily be the case that it's really quite so necessary for learning to read and write effectively to be given such great importance just from the point of getting people to be able to function. It's just thought to be a culturally very valuable thing, our writing system, so that it's writing well is a sign of high culture in that part of the world, whereas at this end of the world, writing well just means you have the hobby of learning to do calligraphy for fun or something, and it really isn't thought of as being high art at all.
There's obviously a huge amount which we will discuss and think about in relation to writing, but perhaps we can move on, make a huge leap. The first great invention, as you say, which allowed a new form of thinking, not just writing down what you already knew, but new ways of considering the world. Many people relate it to the development of new forms of religion, where God is externalized, new forms of law, where the law is in writing, new forms of economy, where you can transform information.
Draw up tables, for instance.
Yes, exactly. All sorts of things you can do with writing. But there's another puzzle, which is if you move on a long period, then you move to a period where you take this idea of making a sign and you automate it. You begin to turn it into a machine through printing. And you have a great enigma. In the West, there are many books about how printing revolutionized Western theory. And it transformed our world, gave us science, gave us Protestantism.
Three things. People say without printing, you can't conceive of how the Renaissance, the Reformation, or the scientific revolution could really have happened the way they did.
Well, there you are. But what about, as they say, China? I mean, China invented printing and used it for some long period before the West. And it doesn't seem to have been, as Reisman called it, the gunpowder of the mind in China. It doesn't
certainly
explode
wasn't,
the society.
almost if anything, the reverse, because it just shows you, I think, that there is no such thing as a technology that just consists of the material means for doing particular kinds of things. The software that goes with it matters, if anything, very often much more. And in the Chinese context, this very convenient process for rapidly multiplying pages of writing played a part in government mind control of the educated classes, because whereas previously they'd said, now, if you want to get a job in the civil service, which is the way the country is governed, there is no aristocracy, it is the emperor ruling through his officials. If you want to get a job in the civil service, which is the really worthwhile career, you must show knowledge of the canon of books that have in them Confucian ideology. Now, you're rather limited in what you can do if people can only get those books by copying them out. If, on the other hand, you can simply say, the following are the set texts for the examination next year, you all go to bookshop and buy them, then you can really get people's nose to the grindstone. And this wonderful machine was constructed by the Chinese Empire that meant that every young Chinese man of good family had to start off, almost as soon as he could waddle about,
beginning to recite these texts, which he had to internalize, and then reading them endlessly, reading commentaries on them, so that most of his adult life was spent in a sense of self-control, self-ideological training, which he did quite voluntarily. So it seems to have had quite the opposite effect. Indeed, it wasn't a revolutionary force by any manner of means, as it was in Europe. Some would point to the technology being different, printing in Europe and China. I think it's worth looking at that for a moment. Chinese printing technology is very cheap. It's actually a low-tech process. You basically carve a wooden block with what's going to go on the page. Movable type is used sometimes, but not usually. And then when you've done that, it's labour really for sort of women and children to do, really. You just ink the block, put some paper over it, smooth it out, peel it off, put another one on, and so on. You don't need skilled people to operate a press, make sure the type is beautifully aligned and so on. Whereas if you're in Europe, you soon find out, as the Gutenbergs did, that actually going into business as a printer is a financially very risky thing. They went bust. They simply could not make enough money to recover the costs of their investment in what they had, which was high precision metal type that had to fit together very carefully in a form under compression, be treated with oily ink rather than Chinese water-based ink. That meant if you were a printer in Europe, you were desperate to find new and exciting books to print. If someone came to you and said, I've got a book that is going to really excite everybody, you might well be prepared to advance that man money and be prepared to have a sales network that will distribute this book quickly around Europe. So if you're a subversive religious thinker, you might well find a printer very willing to put your book out because it would be a hot seller. In China, there's really nothing like the same incentive for a printer to have to turn things over very quickly.
Simon, do you think, if one puts the question, without printing, could you have had the advances in reliable knowledge that we see in Western Europe in that period? Do you think it's an essential instrument of that?
I think it's essential, but I think its significance has been exaggerated. I mean, I think one reason why it's essential is because it's extremely hard to imagine how one could forge, quite specifically, the relations between scholarship and craft artisanship without the print shop. I mean, I think the print shop is almost as important as the press itself. Those new places where new kinds of social relationships were being formed from the 15th until the 17th century are, to all intents and purposes, and with almost no exceptions, the most active and crucial sites of intellectual change, challenge, debate, experiment, argument, commentary in early modern Europe. And the map, the European map of the great print houses just is the European map of the development and spread of the new sciences, beginning with the Rhineland, the Low Countries, and northeastern Italy, then Paris, and then Europe-wide. And again, as usual, as we say over and over again when we're thinking about those more recent centuries of the last 10 millennia, rate of diffusion is extremely high. This is a technology and an institution and a set of relations which then spreads very, very fast. I mean, there's a printing house in Mexico before 1550, and so on. So essential, but exaggerated in the sense that I think the social geography of print is at least as, if not more important than what has most often been emphasized, which is the capacity to produce identical copies in large numbers. I think that is not amazingly new for European scholarship, and the rates of error introduced by the rapid multiplication of faulty printed copies are fairly comparable and often worse than the elite levels of scribal culture. So it's the interaction between forms of sociability and forms of technology.
If we widen out even more to about 100,000 years as an anthropologist or a Martian coming to this planet, what we might see is, rather than our present vision of everything gradually progressing, that human beings start in the worst possible state and then gradually we've toiled up a mountain and we're now at the top of it. Many anthropologists argue that the original state, which was hunting and gathering, was in many ways quite a pleasant existence. You just creamed off the surface of the earth, hunted large animals and gathered plants. And this was in many ways, in the biblical representation, Eden. You picked the fruit of the... Then, they would argue, for reasons, not because it was necessarily more efficient, but for political and other reasons, there was this Neolithic transition which forced people to work harder, to enter into systems of slavery and inequality, into systems where warfare became institutionalized. So that many people...
And they're doing that because they're farming, they're settled.
That's farming, settled farmers.
People have stores that have to be protected, that you can steal.
That's right.
Crops demand continual attention.
That's right.
So
all these things. So basically you move from a world of freedom and equality and not too much labour into a world which is increasingly full of toil by the sweat of thy brow, and into a world of cities and war and indignities and so on. So that this was a great tragedy for the few humans that were on this earth. And therefore, in a way, things went down. And that the beginning of the period that we are really most interested in, which is the last 300 or 400 years, many people who looked around that world said, we are still in this treadmill. The great historian Edward Gibbon, when he looked around, he said 3/4 of mankind is still in slavery and oppression. And it was a world which many thought would continue in that form. All these terrible fruits of civilization had led to a world where women were systematically inferior, where the poor starved, where war, famine and disease marched the earth in the Malthusian vision. And this after some thousands of years of so-called civilization. Then, the argument is, you go through a very dark tunnel, the Industrial Revolution, where things don't appear to be getting any better. And population begins to climb. We now live in a world where there are just about precisely now 6 billion people. Now, at the beginning of our period that we're particularly interested in, 1700, there were about 500 million. There are now 12 times as many people on this globe. And these people, there are still 1 or 2 billion of them who live in misery, as you might call it. But there are now large numbers who live in relative affluence and 1 billion or 2 who live in considerable affluence. So it looks as if you could draw a picture of increasing misery, and then in a very short period, the last 250 years, mankind has for the first time escaped, or part of mankind has escaped, from continuous hard labour in the fields by the sweat of their brow, from systematic oppression and inequality, to a new kind of world. Now that is a different kind of vision from the one we normally have, and I don't know what people feel.
I'd like to comment on both ends of that and say about the Industrial Revolution. If I was asked whether or not it had been a good thing for humanity, I'd answer rather the same way that the great Chinese statesman Zhou Enlai answered when he was asked whether he thought that the French Revolution had been a good thing. He said, "It is too early to tell." I think we must perhaps take that as the verdict for the Industrial Revolution so far. But I must say, I do feel very sceptical about the model of human beings as actually marching steadily towards sunlit uplands as they become more and more civilized and more technically able. I strongly suspect that much of early humanity must have found the transition to settled agriculture and all that represented actually a lowering in their living standards, a less varied diet, far more work, and a harder and more laborious life under conditions of greater stress. Some people might say that the story of the fall, the expulsion from Eden in the book of Genesis, is almost some kind of deep cultural memory of the Neolithic transition, with the man told that he will have to get his bread in the sweat of his face, the woman told that their pains in childbearing will be multiplied, and indeed hunter-gatherer women who carry their children with them and suckle them for a long time have fewer children than do
women living in agricultural societies where they leave their children by the side of the field and do not suckle them for long. And I cannot help feeling that what is it that we've gained as human beings from becoming agriculturalists and from later having more and more complex cities? I think that when we were hunter-gatherers, we invented most of what really matters about being human. We invented our families, our language, our religion, music, dance, poetry, many of the really good things in life. And I'm not quite sure what we've gathered since, actually.
Well, I wonder if a hunting-gathering society could have painted the Mona Lisa or written the Matthäus Passion. I mean, in all due respect to hunter-gatherers who probably had a jolly good life, although if they did, a few questions do come to mind, but we leave that aside. But the fact of the matter is that you are quite right. Family and the sort of basic institutions at the lowest, or the smallest level of society clearly existed in hunting-gathering society. But a great deal of what we call human culture is the product of urban environments that were capable of producing a Rembrandt and a Mozart.
You and I wouldn't have a job, certainly.
Well, that too. And so I tend to be, maybe as an economist, I tend to be far more optimistic and feel that although certainly the change in history is not monotonic and it is not unidirectional, it doesn't go up all the time, it moves in a cycle. But on the whole, I think it is very difficult to argue that if you were to pick a person living in large chunk of Western Europe, most of the British Isles, the Low Country, northern France, parts of Germany, whether the quality of their life in terms of the freedoms, the options that they had in terms of their consumption, whether the things were really not better than they had been, say, at the time of Charlemagne, it would be absurd. People have actually tried to calculate what happened to total output, say, by about 1700 compared to what it was like in Britain during the William the Conqueror. And there can be no question that things were improving. Now, any calculation that tries to compare living standards, say, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution with Neolithic man strike me as just truly absurd. I mean, you're just not really comparing like with like. And it may well be that human culture during the time of the Renaissance or during the Roman Empire or at the height of the Chinese Empire were enjoyed only by a relatively small proportion of the population. And yet this is, to some extent, Homo sapiens' greatest creation. We're not there just counting the number of teeth that hunting and gatherers have. We've left something to posterity which people visit in museums, listen to in concerts, and read in libraries. And in that regard, there is no question that the invention of agriculture and the urban society that it implied produced something that would not have been produced any other way.
Yes.
But even without all this, we just go back to the point that was made by Adam Smith. The progress of the wealth of nations had made it possible for an ordinary laborer to live at a standard of living higher than an African prince of a Neolithic society. That an ordinary laborer could enjoy far more of the amenities.
Consume more goods. His level
Now
of
that
personal
is another.
satisfaction may be a different matter.
How
Now
can you
that is
compare
another.
that?
That's another issue. He could consume more goods, or perhaps she could consume more goods. We could look at this also in terms of choices over the distribution of how households and families spent their time, what they wanted, what they desired. And we have to look into this whole question of the creation of desires and wants and see that the distribution of household time over what is providing oneself for all the family needs, etc., or going out and working for someone else in order to buy things that are beautiful and desirable. This is what is pushing us into consumer society, into capitalism, and into eventually industrialization. It's that shift in labor time within families over keeping everything made at home in the family, or spreading it out and using the division of labor, and especially distributing women's labor time onto new activities, going out to work for other people in order to buy beautiful clothes and ribbons and pottery and to live the civilized life that we want, so that it's not just the very rich who are having this, but the middle classes and the ordinary people too.
Here, here.
Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm very uncomfortable with sitting on the Martian judgment seat, deciding which stage of human development over the last 100,000 years looks good to me. I guess one way of putting the point is that I'm extremely uncomfortable with the use of the word "we" here, because I don't particularly identify with the various groups that we've just been talking about. And one reason why I find it very hard to identify with them, and we've all said that we've here all said that in different ways, is because patterns of pleasure and pain and expectation and memory are the guts of culture. I mean, it seems to me that what counts as satisfying reasonable expectations, what counts, exactly as Maxine said, as wants and desires, hopes and expectations, is given by the very specific situation in which groups of human beings find themselves. One is extremely suspicious, for example, of that persistent theme since certainly the period of the European Enlightenment, that is to say the period of the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century, which we associate with the name above all of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that is nostalgic about hunting and gathering, that sees the last best hope of humankind in plucking fruits from the trees and giving up on urbanity and giving up on technique. One is very, very suspicious.
We just don't have that choice, do we?
That, partly because we don't have that choice, and partly because the consequences of that choice are so often ignored. One of the great lessons, it seems to me, of all the discussions that we've been having is just how much that we take for granted has been made possible and exists because of almost subterranean, unexpected, systemic developments in technique, indeed, but also exploitation, warfare, cruelty, but also progress and happiness. The standard joke is, I would live as a hunter-gatherer provided there was, for example, penicillin.
Or a dental service.
And a nearby, reliable, free dental service.
And a library around the corner.
And no doubt a library around the corner. And once, as a late 20th century...
Yes. We could not go back that way.
Yes. Once one starts to write down as a late 20th century citizen what turns out to be contingent on the particular arrangements of our world, we find ourselves in what I then think is the other extreme. Because if one extreme is a nostalgia about probably a non-existent past and this strange identification which we associate with Rousseau.
It's a nostalgia also associated with the community of poverty.
Well, I was going to talk about that,
yes.
because the other extreme, which I also would want to avoid, and which I think our discussions here should also remind us of, is that the last best hope of humankind, facing the appalling facts of industrialization, exploitation, slavery, war, and gross inequality, is precisely the hope that a much better form of social arrangement could be secured. I mean, so nostalgia is clearly a very often highly conservative, extremely distressing, and almost always ill-informed account of what human purposes should be. But so is the complacency which identifies the immediate present with the best of all possible worlds. Just before Rousseau, there is, and he's viciously caricatured in Voltaire's Candide, that Leibnizian figure who is figured by Dr. Pangloss, who simply can't imagine a better world than this one, because it was created by a mixture of reason and wisdom, and anything logically possible exists. And in the best of all possible worlds, what exists must be the best of all possible things.
Was good.
And
Yes. It's just the best of all possible worlds.
Yes, and to deny the radical possibility of substantial change in highly unexpected ways, dependent on collective human purposes, is to deny one of the great lessons of history. So somehow or other, between hopeless nostalgia and far too complacent affirmation of our present, I think those are the two great errors against which the history of the great industrial transformation should counsel us. And we can hope for better things, but only with the collaboration of all. Here endeth the first lesson.
Can I just make two final points, and then we can see if we need to go back over anything else. The other, that you summarised brilliantly some of the lessons we've learned from looking at this. I think, certainly for me, and I think for many of us, another thing that it's emphasised, which we thought about right at the beginning, is the totally accidental, unexpected chance of what has happened. Again and again we tend to think that because it happened, it had to happen like that. And in one sense, philosophically, it did happen. And yet as we unwind the tape backwards and then look at the choices as we move further and further back, we see how very small things, very small differences between civilization, very accidental discoveries, and often terrible things, have unintended consequences which have led to where we are. So it looks like a giant accident. There are many historians who think it's predestined still. They write as if at some point in time it had to happen like this. I think it never had to happen like this until yesterday. And today we don't know. No one is able to predict. No one predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, the day before it happened. No one predicted the French Revolution, and even through the middle of it, no one knew it was happening. So you really don't know, because it's all a vast game of chance and accident and unintended consequences. That's one lesson I've learned from it. The other lesson I've learned, I think, is how much all of us, when you refuse to say, who are we? I don't know who I am, because as we look at the table of objects, and as we hear about these different civilizations, and particularly the role of different countries like China, we begin to realize we are not. I used to think I was, good British chap, or whatever I thought I was. I now realize I'm a composite of Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, South American civilization. All these streams that have flowed down through history over thousands of years have ended up at this table in each of us.
Are passing through this table.
Ended up at it.
Passing through into the future. And we are therefore a composite not only of technologies and knowledge systems, but everything else. And this should give one a little bit of humility that we are not. And all this dreadful feeling of nationalism and ethnic conflict, because we are we and they are they. Hopefully the consideration of how we're all interlinked in this world may contribute towards ameliorating that, as long as we can remember it for a few seconds.
I think one of the most interesting lessons of thinking about the Industrial Revolution from a very long perspective, 500, 1,000, 10,000 years, is that it reminds you of the extraordinary way in which developments can be unexpected or unanticipated. It's true that one tries to make sense of what's happening in one's world by appealing to precedent and the past, and it's a very good game to try and find equivalents in past time. But most of these searches, I think, boil down to a desperate effort to render the unfamiliar familiar. Very good example of this is whether or not we're living through a kind of second great transformation.
The first one being the old industrial revolution.
The first one being the complex of steam technology, consumer society, mass production, and social transformation from the middle of the 18th to the middle of the 19th century, which we've been trying to explain. The second allegedly being then an information revolution, driven by worldwide networks of information and communication, which seem extraordinarily unprecedented and which seem to have remarkable socially transformative effects. I'm extremely skeptical. I'm skeptical for two related reasons. One is one of the great lessons of trying to explain how the process of industrialization took place 200-300 years ago and why it took place then and where it took place has been substantially to draw our attention away from particular local bits of technology towards the importance of the much wider settings and wider contexts in which they happen. For example, you can't explain the enormous availability of capital in 18th century Britain unless you think very hard about sugar. Profits on sugar are very high. Sugar relied on the slave trade. You've immediately got to pull focus back to a really global perspective. Now try doing that with the world of the internet. It's true that this changes patterns of communication for substantial portions of the world population. But out of a world population of 6 billion, the vast majority do not even have a telephone.
Exactly.
We are living in a world of extraordinarily uneven development, and it seems to me that the unevenness of that development, I mean uneven economic development, uneven technical development, uneven degrees of being wired at all, would make us think as historians that highly unexpected, highly unanticipated consequences are likely to follow from very subtle changes, even when they're restricted to the industrial societies. On the other hand, we've also wanted to emphasize the overwhelming importance of knowledge and information systems as part and parcel of the way in which social change happens. So that, for example, your story, Chris, about the overwhelming significance of writing, providing a means of artificial memory.
New orderings of information that use space to order information rather than just a sequence in which you tell a story.
Sure. And I think because it's not widely understood just how radical those kinds of transformations were, it's all too easy to lapse into a kind of apocalyptic, that is to say, an over-dramatic, over-emotive response to whatever set of technical changes are going on in the information system around us. So for those two reasons, one is don't just concentrate on the hardware, think about the software too, and the second is remember just how global the great technical and social changes of the past were. I'm skeptical about seeing the process that we're living through now at the end of our millennium as a major revolution to compare with those previous ones.
Yes, well, we shall have to see retrospectively whether you're right or not in 50 years' time, perhaps. One thing I think that this concentration nowadays on information technology does do for us is to enable us to look with a clearer sort of hindsight on some aspects of the human past, and perhaps to see technology where previously we might not have seen any technology at all.
Yes,
thus, for instance, there is now a profession in some countries recognised as being an information engineer. There are some parts of the United States where it's illegal to do that because being an engineer is still defined as somebody who makes bits of matter and energy move about, but information moves about too. And if we look back, for instance, on the great bureaucracies of the past, we begin to see them as immense software machines for moving and processing information. We see them as technologies where previously we would not have seen a technology. The sort of records produced by the early Sumerian scribes, the immense complexity of the Chinese civil service with its digesting of information, passing it up the chain, its capacity to transmit instructions. This is now something we can call certainly information engineering.